Okay. So this is the programme for today. Catherine Ferguson, who's General Editor for the British Record Society Hearth Tax series with Parts of England. Catherine's going to give us an introduction to the Hearth Tax as a historical source, and particularly some of the pitfalls with using what might appear to be quite straightforward lists of names and hearth numbers. Then we'll have a session on London and Bristol. Peter Guillory and Roger Leach both speaking about the work they've done for the published volumes that have appeared in the British Record Society series on London, Middlesex and Bristol. We'll then have an hour's break for lunch and come back at 1:20 for a pair of papers on houses in the countryside. And I'm delighted that David Martin is able to speak to us about Sussex and David Neve on East Yorkshire. We'll then have on the Scottish borders, Roger Curtis talking about a project he's been doing on vernacular buildings in the borders, and Lizzie Parkinson, who is a very great expert actually on the Hearth Tax and its intricacies as a taxation, as a record of taxation. Lizzie is very expert on the Hearth Tax, and she's going to talk to us about Glamorgan houses. And then I'm just going to say something very briefly at the end, and we'll close at 4:30. With each of the sessions, we'll take questions at the end of each pair of papers. So each speaker has been asked to speak for 35 minutes, and then we'll have 10 minutes or so for discussion at the end of each session. Okay, having created this generous introduction period, I realised I was actually going to have to say something between now and 10:20. This conference is very much revisiting an earlier vernacular architecture conference, which was held in Oxford and led to this splendid public house and society. And it was very much Paul Barnwell with Malcolm Ayres who organised that conference in Oxford. Many of the people who spoke then are present today, or indeed speaking today. And that volume really presented the current state of research, a lot of it quite exploratory at that stage, into houses and the hearth tax in different counties, and really people working on different parts of the country, preparing particular volumes for the British Record Society series. The book remains very useful. It's a very helpful introduction to different parts of the country, but there's a particularly helpful article there by Tom Arkle on exemption from the tax, because anybody who's not familiar with the hearth tax, the key thing to grasp is that exemption isn't as straightforward as you might think. People who are exempt from the tax were not necessarily in desperate poverty. In fact, they were often more like the working poor, people who were too poor to pay the tax, but were not necessarily themselves paupers in receipt of relief, though some of them would have been. We'll hear more about that as we go on today, but it's worth noting right at the outset that exemption from the tax doesn't necessarily mean desperate poverty. Again, for those who are new to the hearth tax, it's an extremely important source, not least for housing, but for social history generally, because it's the nearest thing we have to a census before the 19th century. It's a very comprehensive record of people living in settled communities throughout Britain and Ireland, in fact. And the great thing about the hearth tax as a source is that it includes the lists of householders, normally the occupiers, or if the house is empty, specify the owner of the property, and then include those who were exempt from payment, as well as those who were actually charged to pay on their hearths. So it was introduced at the Restoration in 1662, very much to fund King Charles II, and the Crown at that point was short of funds, so this was an effort to raise funds through a form of direct taxation. It was extremely unpopular in England and Wales, and it was regarded often as a sort of infringement on English liberties. Entering the home, this was regarded as something to be resisted often, and indeed direct taxation is removed in 1688 when William and Mary come to the throne at the Glorious Revolution. The tax is abolished for England and Wales, and direct taxation isn't introduced again, in fact, till the 1790s. It's not till the wars with France in the 1790s that income tax is introduced on a temporary basis. It's yet to be relaxed. The tax was also levied in Scotland in the mid-1690s, and there's a separate project in Scotland analysing the Hearth Tax. The Hearth Tax also continued in Ireland. It was never relaxed in Ireland at any point in the 18th century. The Hearth Tax continued. In England and Wales, the Hearth Tax was actually replaced by the famous window tax in the 1690s. But that tax didn't aim to capture anything like the same amount of income, and in fact was placed at a much higher tax threshold. It didn't try to tax the same proportion of the population. So the Hearth Tax exists for this brief window from the 1660s through to the 1680s, and we have our best surviving records centrally at the National Archives, particularly for certain years in the mid-1660s and early 1670s. Exceptionally, some local areas have surviving local records, and if you can track down local records in county record offices, normally they're normally parish records if the constable's collection lists survive. Those local, where they do survive, they're exceptionally informative because they often have very detailed annotations on the Hearth Tax in particular places. So obviously we'll hear a great deal more about the tax in the course of the day. I wanted to pay tribute at the start to Margaret Spufford, who set up a project which is very much where today's conference is coming out from, which is the Hearth Tax Research Project based at the University of Roehampton. And this is a British Academy funded project for the various towns and counties of England. And the British Record Society, with Catherine Ferguson as the editor, is the actual publisher producing the printed volumes. The Hearth Tax Centre at Roehampton is also engaged with what's called Hearth Tax Digital, which is making the transcripts of the original records available online. And if you go to the Centre for Hearth Tax Research website, you will find the link to Hearth Tax Digital. You can access online transcripts for some counties through Hearth Tax Digital. The printed volumes, and Catherine's going to tell us about the series a little more in a moment. The printed volumes, which have appeared for various counties and are still in preparation for further counties, one of the really significant things about these is that they include analysis of buildings. And it was part of Margaret Spufford's vision for the project that every county would include a discussion of the actual houses that the Hearth Tax relates to. It's worth noting that Margaret Spufford, who was very much a social historian, was taught by W.G. Hoskins at the Centre for Local History in Leicester, and very aware of the significance of looking at buildings and housing. Unlike a lot of documentary historians who have focused more on the documents without engaging with the actual buildings, Margaret was very much an exception as a social historian who was aware of the value of looking at buildings. And it's a really important part of the series that we've had these expert introductions, and we're hearing from several speakers today who have produced particular volumes on London, Bristol, Sussex in print. A little bit fuzzy, but this is the cover for the series that Margaret designed. The Durham Hearth Tax that came out quite early. Lizzie Parkinson, Margaret and myself produced that volume. Nat Alpop with Tom Arkle produced the Warwickshire volume, and a whole team of people were involved in the London and Middlesex volume. And Margaret, I'm sorry these images are quite fuzzy, but they show particular chimney pieces and chimneys from the 17th century, and it's a sort of uniform livery for the series. Okay, that's what I wanted to say by way of introduction. Thanks to all the speakers, and particularly thanks to Lorraine and Bev for the organisation and getting us all onto Zoom in good time.